When we think of iconic heroes versus villains, we think of Batman versus Joker, Spider-Man versus Green Goblin, and Superman versus Lex Luthor. However, these rivalries aren't just defined by their pop cultural iconography, but rather by their battles' tumultuous and unexpected outcomes. With this criteria in mind, let's look at another iconic hero versus villain to see how it compares, and it is none other than Optimus Prime versus Megatron, a rivalry that stood the test of time with countless battles over the years. However, their rivalry is missing an essential component to put it on the same level as those mentioned. But what if I told you that Marvel has already given a blueprint for Hasbro to adapt Optimus vs. Megatron on the big screen properly? In today's video, we'll look at when Marvel did Optimus vs. Megatron better in Age of Ultron. To better understand how Marvel portrayed the internal conflict between Optimus and Megatron, let's first understand how they got to this point. With characters as old as these two, there are countless origins to their conflict, but for today's video, we'll look at their origins starting with the prequel IDW comics. In this universe, Optimus was revealed to be the last living descendant of the great dynasty of Primes, but because he was orphaned for most of his life, he never truly understood who he was. This was until he was discovered by another who claimed to be a descendant of Primus, Sentinel Prime, who took him under his wing and adopted him into his tribe of Autobots. It was here that Optimus would meet his fellow peers, Elita 1 and Megatron, who were tasked with restoring energy to their home world via the Allspark, which is buried beneath the surface of their planet. However, thanks to an expedition led by Wheeljack, they could restore life to Cybertron and undergo an era of peace. Although Cybertron had finally restored itself, Sentinel Prime no longer had interest in leading and decided it was time for Optimus to know the truth in hopes that he would instead lead in this new era. But upon discovering his true identity, Optimus lobbied to discover the history of Cybertron instead. Thus, he was made head of the science division, but his decision infuriated Megatron, who was upset that Optimus would turn down his birthright. As head of the Defense Force, Megatron and Optimus could coexist. However, when Cybertron came under attack, Megatron lobbied for the scientific division to become warriors and join him on his crusade against the attackers. Optimus would argue against this as his division wasn't made for combat, but Megatron wasn't trying to hear this and lashed out against Optimus. This would eventually lead to the former brother-in-arms falling out and starting the Autobot-Decepticon civil war. This now brings us to the movies, where most of this context was missing from fleshing out the relationship between Optimus and Megatron. Now, for their first interaction in the Bayverse, you could overlook this because most of their origin would be fleshed out in prequel comics for Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon. Then there was a writer's strike in 2008 that affected the entire writing process of Revenge of the Fallen, which then proved why it was a jumbled mess, and then a controversial prequel comic for Dark of the Moon, which would spoil the death of Ironhide. However, some elements made it into the final film, such as Sentinel being Optimus' mentor and leader of the Autobots before him. Despite the miscues with the comics, the relationship between Optimus and Megatron seemed to be defined by macho heroism, where there will be few words between the bitter rivals and only jaw-dropping action, which is fine, especially if it's done right. But when you limit their rivalry to just that, it misses what makes it interesting, and that's their differing political views as it relates to the betterment of Cybertron and how those views strain their relationship. So, how can Hasbro adapt to the complexities of their relationship while maintaining the rule of cool? Well, luckily for them, this issue has already been solved with the MCU in 2015's Age of Ultron, which introduced the classic Avengers villain, Ultron, and his rival Vision. Despite the fact that Age of Ultron and subsequent Transformer films tackle different plots, there are similarities between the four characters that can provide Hasbro with a blueprint for adapting Optimus and Megatron. Let's first examine both the antagonist and protagonist's goal to understand their similarities. Both Ultron and Megatron have similar goals for fixing their broken systems. For Ultron, that system is humanity, but specifically the Avengers. To Ultron, the Avengers contradict what they fight for, which is for peace and protection of humanity. Although this is something they fully believe in, it is their actions to the rest of the world that say otherwise. This point was further expressed with the use of anti-American propaganda throughout the film as a way to show the disconnect that even Americans with the best intentions can be blind to the effects of their unintended consequences. Megatron shares this same sentiment, as he too believes in change because the system isn't going the way he wants it to. He believed that it was time for Cybertron to evolve past their ways of peace, become less of a defensive-based society, and become one that would exacerbate war when necessary. Much like their malevolent counterparts, Prime and Vision also share similarities. Vision was born into a world that had already experienced the tumultuous battle between good and evil, and was on the brink of experiencing it again with the threat of Ultron on the rise. Furthermore, he was burdened with this responsibility to put an end to it by those, the Avengers, whom he's supposed to share this vision with, although he found it undiplomatic. For Optimus, he was also born into a world that experienced a tumultuous battle of good and evil, and thus his world, Cybertron, had adapted to these new means. When Vision was initially brought into this world as the final solution to humanity's extinction, the Avengers came in the nick of time to change this outcome and make him a force for life. As for Optimus, he was the last born of the legendary Prime dynasty, but as a means of keeping him safe, he was never told this secret. However, as Megatron started to change his ways, Optimus had to become a force for life and would willingly sacrifice himself if it meant protecting life from Megatron's wrath with the Allspark. Their similarities also extend to the vehicle pushing them towards their why. Ultron advocates for the extinction of humanity because, based on a fragment of what humanity supposedly represents, he deems that it is time for us to be extinguished and for a new world to rise from our ashes. Although different, this was the same reasoning Megatron had for carrying out a full-on genocide against the aliens from the Ishim's Nebula. In this instance, two things can be true. Yes, they did attack unprovoked, but the attackers were more than likely a fragment of what their entire species stood for. So, to carry out a full assault like that doesn't make you any better, nor does it seek to find a true resolution to the conflict. Much like Ultron trying to eliminate only a fragment based on a limited scope that clearly has a bias that is trying to portray, these same biases can be found when Megatron came under control of the Fallen. Only sharing his view of Cybertron and how his downfall came to be, Megatron had no choice but to see the world that way. This same push was also thrust upon Optimus and Vision through the Avengers and Sentinel Prime respectively. The Avengers are byproducts of the world they live in, and although they're not a perfect solution to the world's problems, they actively help where possible. Hence why we see Tony go through the arc he does, because he understands that the Avengers need to change, and he had the right idea despite the first attempt turning into Ultron. For Sentinel Prime, he was a byproduct of the world that the Primes before him unintentionally created. Their greatest invention was the Star Harvester, a device that took stars and converted them into harvestable energy for Cybertron. But their only rule was to never absorb a sun that was the source of life. However, one of their own would disobey this rule and would be forever known as the Fallen. An unintentional creation of their evolution, the Primes accidentally birthed the first Decepticon. Even though they did defeat the Fallen, he would arise again due to the unearthing of his artifact on Cybertron. A Cybertron that Sentinel Prime helped shape into an era of peace, but this was a peace that wasn't as perfect as he had planned. Despite his best efforts, he could not stop the brewing threat of Megatron, for he believed that he treated him and Optimus equally, unsuspecting that Megatron would grow jealous of Optimus because he too found out that Optimus was a Prime. With those similarities in mind, let's now look at how Marvel was able to do it better. The key difference between Megatron and Ultron is that Ultron is actively pursuing his endgame, and there is never a second where his motives are unclear or become secondary to the story. With Megatron, however, we never truly understand what he wants besides to transform Earth's machines to build a new army. Even though it technically is a goal, he spends half of the first movie encased in ice, and in the subsequent sequels, he takes a backseat to the Fallen, Sentinel Prime, KSI, and Quintessa. His goals only happen when it's convenient for the story to remind you, oh yeah, here's Megatron, and he's supposed to be this layered villain, but we won't tell you that, you're just supposed to put the pieces together with strung along dialogue. Unlike Megatron, we actively see Optimus pursuing this goal of bringing peace to a world unaware of Cybertron's past mistakes. However, it all falls flat because it lacks a critical component: dialogue. You see, we're supposed to believe that there is more to this conflict than meets the eye.
Boy, if you don't...
But We as an audience don't get to know that because it's all packaged together in throwaway lines such as,
"You left me no choice, brother."
And
"We were brothers once."
because before either of those lines being said, we don't see actions to justify the meaning of those lines. Ultimately, this is what makes the ending scene between Vision and Ultron better than any live-action Optimus vs. Megatron conflict. Throughout Age of Ultron, we see the world through Ultron's eyes, lending us a better understanding of what he wants to achieve. It also tells us what role Vision plays in it and what he has to do to earn whatever ending the writers may have in store for the character. So, what does the future hold for these old rivals? Well, as of now, we haven't seen them meet in the new live-action movie universe, but we will see them on the big screen again later this year in September in an animated feature-length film, Transformers 1, that will explore the origin of Orion Pax and D16, as we will see the events that forge the path of their rivalry in the division of Cybertron. Now, as a Transformers connoisseur myself, I'm excited to finally see their story get the proper attention that it deserves. But more importantly, now the general audience will know and could potentially springboard their rivalry to new heights. For those of you who are new to the TF fandom, I'd recommend watching Transformers Prime to get a general idea of this version of their rivalry, as it has become the most popular and is slowly becoming their default origin. But the beauty of Transformers is that it is constantly changing, so no origin or character ever stay the same. So if you want more from the rivalry between Optimus and Megatron, there are different starts to their rivalry that I'd be glad to cover in future YouTube videos. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you all next week in a video about everyone's favorite smooth talking Autobot Jazz and my personal favorite boisterous boombox Blaster.